We are on page 38 in the notes. Remember, we're talking about the beginnings of the Novus Ordo that began to be implemented. Its development certainly began to be implemented during the reign of Pius XII. And as we said before, nothing intrinsically evil. There was nothing intrinsically evil promulgated to the entire church, of course, but things were definitely getting started. And this is no conspiracy theory cooked up by traditionalists in later decades. Bugnini was saying it from day one. So we'll start at the section Liturgical Publications in the left-hand column on page 38. Attention should be called, at least in passing, to two other factors that played a part in the expectation of reform and in preparation for it. The publications issued from time to time by the Roman periodical Ephemerides Liturgicae and in the International Congress held at Assisi in 1956. On January 28, 1948, the editors of Ephemerides Liturgicae sent a questionnaire on reform of the Missal, breviary, calendar, martyrology, and other liturgical books to almost 100 liturgical experts in all parts of the world. And you see what's in mind here is an overhaul of everything. Yes, various popes have previously brought about changes, and some of them considerably extensive changes, but always recognizable from what came before. We see obviously the Novus Ordo goes far beyond that, with just trying to maintain some links to what was in place before. But here clearly they have in mind an overhaul of everything. So the questionnaire, sent as it was by the editorial staff of a periodical regarded as the semi-official voice of Roman liturgical circles, was the first alarm signal that something was stirring. In those days, it was unheard of for anyone to challenge a rubric or to use the word reform. The questionnaire was therefore a bold move. Anyway, this is all Bugnini himself speaking. So he's really, really praising himself, which is slightly nauseating, but he is praising himself. Talking about, remember we saw that earlier, he clearly has no problem doing that, talking about how this commission was able to achieve a tremendous amount in a very short space of time, and nobody can deny that. Of course, he was involved in that. So clearly admiring himself there considerably. The questionnaire was a bold move. And actually, you see what he says here is presenting it as some form of cowardice or of servility not to challenge a rubric or to use the word reform. Well, for one thing, various popes had initiated reforms before. It's not as though there was a fear of a true healthy reform of any liturgical book or the modification of some rite when it was truly necessary. But it's true that there was generally obedience to the rubrics, which are, in fact, they bind, certainly to a great extent, the rubrics bind under pain of sin. That it would be sinful for the celebrant of the Mass to disregard various rubrics. And different authors, rubricists, moral theologians, and so forth, have their different opinions as to where exactly the line is to be drawn between rubrics that do bind under pain of sin, those which bind under pain of mortal sin or only venial sin. But indeed, the rubrics are to be obeyed to the letter, of course, barring any kind of further amendment, or even there are such things as customs contrary to law. But on the whole, the rubrics, it's a serious obligation to follow the rubrics. There are certain ones that very clearly bind under pain of mortal sin. So what he's saying here is true in a good sense, that there was, generally speaking, obedience to the rubrics. There was none of this free-for-all stuff that's clearly allowed in the Novus Ordo today. Everything was very well regulated. Very well regulated. As we said before, the SRC, when the Sacred Congregation of Rites, or more correctly, Congregation of Sacred Rites, would hand down a decision, that was it. That was the Pope himself really speaking in that case. So the questionnaire was a bold move. In this case, the proverb was true: fortune favors the brave. For the questionnaire was not a front for secret maneuvering, and that itself is immediately suspicious. Why say that if it's not? Yeah, that would be like saying, I assure you, there is no bomb in this room. And you'd be thinking, I didn't think there was. Why would you say that? And you'd be right in thinking so. Well, why say that? If it's not true, if that's not the case, then why say that? Why would you go up to someone and say, I'm not planning to rob a bank tonight? All right, great, thanks for letting me know that you are. This is what you'd be inclined to think. The questionnaire was not a front for secret maneuvering, but simply a free and risky undertaking by the young editor-in-chief of the periodical. So Father Chikata's comment on this, which is in his book, Work of Human Hands, is he said the questionnaire was not a front for secret maneuvering, which in Bugnini speak, as we shall soon see, means that it was. And it had an immediate effect. Bugnini states that the questionnaire roused a very great deal of interest. Above all, it encouraged scholars to direct their researches to the goal of practical reform. And in hindsight, of course, it's obvious what that means. Father Chikata comments, in other words, it was a secret signal to the left of the liturgical movement to begin agitating for particular changes, which clearly they thought they could get from Pius XII, and we'll see to a very great extent they did. So this is another very interesting thing that we'll look at here, Jungmann's dream. So we'll go into this in a bit. One recipient of Bugnini's questionnaire was Theodor Klauser, a member of the Liturgical Commission of the Fulda Bishops' Conference. Klauser immediately informed fellow commission members of Bugnini's initiative. They concluded that an hour had struck in the history of the liturgy which could not be passed up. The Fulda Liturgical Commission met at Banz Abbey from the 1st to the 3rd of June 1948. According to meeting notes taken by Monsignor Johannes Wagner, Joseph Jungmann had been very quietly asked to present for discussion by the Commission his thoughts for a possible reform of the Mass. Remember, 1948. In a series of meetings with the Commission, Jungmann presented his ideas for a reform of the Mass, his Traum in Herzen, or his heart's dream, he called it. This is something very near and dear to his heart, something he would love to see or realize. This is his dream. Jungmann dreamed of eliminating from the Mass multiple orations and kisses of the altar, reducing the number of genuflections, de-emphasizing the consecration, reciting the prayers at the foot of the altar at the Sedilia, contrasting, quote-unquote, the consecration with Scripture, introducing more Scripture, supposedly, as there was not enough in the Mass already, inserting a prayer of the faithful, changing the offertory prayers, shortening the canon, eliminating some saints in the canon, emphasizing the doxology at the end of the canon, introducing a hymn of thanksgiving after communion, putting the readings here is, Father Chikata uses this term in his book all the time. I imagine because that's something that will be more easily recognizable to the Novus Ordo audiences at whom he largely aimed the work. The traditional term is actually lessons. So talk about the epistle and the gospel at the Mass, for example, are the lessons. To call them readings was just a little thing in itself. That's not a big deal. They are obviously read at Mass. There's nothing offensive to the faith in that, but it was just another little thing because lesson sounds a little too much like there's authority involved here. Teaching authority. We can't have that. So it's a reading. We're just sitting around having story time or something. So, So if you see, in some cases I substitute the term lessons here to use the more traditional term. But that's just a small note. Just a small way, just a little thing, and the Novus Ordo had to change absolutely everything. Absolutely every little thing had to change, including what you call the epistle and the gospel at the Mass. So all of these, putting the readings or the lessons into the vernacular and possibly allowing more vernacular still. All these proposals were the logical consequences of Jungmann's corruption theory. So Jungmann, understand, was a liturgical modernist, just through and through. In fact, a number of years ago, a seminarian had somehow managed to get a copy of some of Jungmann's works, or at least his big work on the Mass. And he asked Father Chikata if this was worth having. He said, well, I managed to get it for free in Germany. And Father Chikata's response was, oh, that's the right price for it. He was a modernist. So he did say, though, after that, but if you're inoculated to the modernism in it, you can actually get some good information from it. Jungmann actually did know some things. He could be called an expert even on these matters, which was why he was able to make a case for his modernistic ideas. He was able to present things in such a way, with the reputation of being such an expert, that he came up with this corruption theory, which we'll touch on briefly here. We don't have time to discuss all of these people. Jungmann could be the subject of his contributions to the Novus Ordo, to liturgical modernism, could be potentially a whole course all on its own, probably a minor one, but you could make that into something much bigger than we have time to cover here. In fact, all of this was the subject of an entire course that Pius used to give. All of this, he gave multiple different courses on the sacred liturgy, and one of them was De Aetate Moderna, concerning the modern age, and that involved heavily the formation of the Novus Ordo. And so he used to cover all this, and we really used to do it in a separate course. Here we're touching on it as far as we can. Certain things that really ought to be emphasized when we're looking at just to what extent the reign of Pius XII was, in fact, the threshold of Vatican II, as it undeniably was, unfortunately. So look at some things that Jungmann said, and this corruption theory that we've been alluding to is the idea that the addition of prayers and rites to the Mass over the centuries after the time of the Emperor Constantine had debased or obscured a primitive, quote-unquote, liturgical ideal, or primitive, or ideal should be in quotes there, a primitive liturgical ideal. So you see it's something like Rousseau's theories with regard to the formation of civilization, that the ideal is a man running around in the forest by himself, completely independent from any kind of social contract or social strictures and norms and things like that. That's the ideal. That was the ideal. And then, things happened to make life easier. So Jungmann's theory is along similar lines, in as much as he thinks that ideal in the earliest centuries of the church, everything was really great, as it ought to be. And that over time it got corrupted. Which makes no sense. And for that matter, you might as well, by analogy, you should say that the development of technology is corruption. I mean, in some certainly it brings corruption with it. It makes sin easier in many ways, but in itself, that's not an evil thing. This is actually quite the opposite of corruption. The church improved upon the rites of the Mass over many centuries. So the point that when you get actually to studying the rubrics for saying Mass, practicing saying Mass and after ordination, saying Mass every day, almost every day, with rare exception, you realize that the Mass really is the perfect ceremony. Every little thing has been thought out thoroughly. There's nothing has been left unpolished. Not to say that that the rites of the Mass, it's impossible to, they're the most perfect possible of all ceremonies, but in the sense that, not to say that a subsequent pope could still make some minor change that might not improve things slightly, but in many ways it is the perfect ceremony. This is everything, at every step of the way, everything is exactly as it ought to be. You can see how it's been all very carefully thought out over really millennia at this point. So the Mass truly is the perfect ceremony, quite the opposite of having been corrupted. It's been perfected. But modernists, because they want to use this as an excuse for corrupting actually corrupting the Mass, Jungmann puts forward this theory that the Mass is being corrupted. Not only the Mass, other rites as well, but of course most of all the Mass being at the absolute pinnacle of it all. So he has his theory is that it's being corrupted over the centuries. But what is even more important for our discussion here, Jungmann's Dream Mass is essentially the Mass of Paul VI in 1948. And since Jungmann, like Bugnini, will be intimately involved in formulating the liturgical changes both before and after Vatican II, we should understand from the outset where everything will be headed. So clearly, this is what they have in mind. The liturgical modernists have the formation of the Novus Ordo clearly in mind. Not only in mind, but in the closest thing to Jungmann's heart, his dearest dream. It's already, in his mind anyway, clearly formulated already. He just laid out the description of the Novus Ordo, Missae, right there. how you could get. Certainly, the Novus Ordo did all of those things at some point along the way. All of those things were done, and now to the point now that yes, shortening the canon, eliminating saints from the canon. You now have the Novus Ordo again having to change absolutely everything. Change the name from canon, which actually reflects reality. Canon means unchangeable. That refers to something completely unchangeable, a fixed yardstick, a rule, according to which everything else is measured. Of course, the Novus Ordo, giving infinite options, provides multiple Eucharistic prayers, as they're called, one of which takes maybe 5 minutes. It's the quick one, the quick, fast option. Gets people out faster from a thing that really they don't want to be doing at all. So, keeping in mind that's where we're heading, we'll have to look now at some of the major liturgical changes enacted during the reign of Pius XII, such as the New Holy Week. So it referred to it usually as the 1955 Holy Week. That's not when the development began. So in 1951, there was the experimental Easter Vigil. So some historical notes on the general ceremonies of the Easter Vigil, held on Holy Saturday. Holy Saturday was originally a day on which no Mass was offered, for obvious reasons, because on the first Holy Saturday, Christ was in the tomb, and the apostles did not offer Mass. Instead, during the night from Holy Saturday to Easter Sunday, the Church kept a lengthy vigil. And notice that, a lengthy vigil. It went all night, as we have the next thing in the notes. The faithful watched the whole night in the church and awaited the celebration of the first Mass of Easter, which concluded the vigil early Easter morning. So they greeted the dawn with the Mass after having been in the church all night long. It was perhaps sundown the evening before. They were there all night long. And actually, you could see, sometimes ceremonies can take many hours. You could see how adding other elements to it, such as multiple baptisms, confirmations, ordinations, and so forth, it could easily be stretched out to last all night long. What we have now is in fact, when you look at it, as we'll see here, a very condensed version of all of the ceremonies that were done in the history of the Church. It's all been, in a sense, and not that anything essential was chopped out, but you see Holy Saturday in particular is really a series of ceremonies. And all of those retain at least something of exactly, in fact, early practices of the church. The things that the modernists profess to love so much, they actually reduced. We'll see that. So, as Christianity triumphed throughout the world, there were fewer adult converts to be baptized, and so interest in assisting at the great vigil waned. So the ceremonies took less time, people had less motive to go to it, and so forth. So then they began to get shorter, fervor again. Once times of persecution were over, also the fact of the matter is that fervor tended to decline. In fact, did decline. When it becomes, say, generally socially acceptable to be a Catholic, more people enter the church, and perhaps not for always the highest of motives. See, in the earliest centuries of the church, to become a member of the church was practically to sign your own death warrant. You had a high chance of dying a martyr's death. And so obviously only the most fervent would embrace that. Anybody who was not sure I want to die for this would probably not embrace the faith at all. At least would not enter the church, certainly. Whereas later on, when there was much less risk involved in entering the church, people who are less fervent will come in and bring their, decrease the average level of fervor, and that just begets, of course, further decline of fervor. Not to say that nothing can be done to reverse that, but that is a general trend. And so this is due to the fact that there are fewer adult converts, more people being baptized just as they're born, as babies, and then general decline of fervor also. People become less interested in going to very long ceremonies, especially the ones that last the entire night. So this, and then you see, the church always grants concessions whenever it's possible, so that people at least don't sin. Also granted various relaxations in the laws of fasting. So all of those previous factors we mentioned, coupled with various relaxations in the law of fasting, led in the 11th century to gradually anticipating the vigil ceremony on Holy Saturday itself until it finally started to be observed on Holy Saturday morning. So it got pulled back gradually. So we'll start a little bit earlier, and we'll only do this in the afternoon. It'll be done before too late, and then keeps getting pulled back earlier and earlier into the day, so that now we've started Easter Vigil at 6 a.m. Many places start a bit later than that. But it's actually, there are advantages to starting in the dark, because you have that actually the ceremonies clearly anticipate that you're coming in from the dark into a darkened church that becomes lighter as the ceremony goes on. There are definite advantages to starting in the pre-dawn darkness. That's how far early into the day it's been pulled back. So, over the years, bishops who supported the liturgical movement have repeatedly asked the Holy See for permission to celebrate the Easter Vigil at night on Holy Saturday. Pastoral reasons were adduced for the change in time. The Saturday morning services were not well attended, at least in some places, as well as authenticity. Supposedly, the prayers speak of this night, which it's true they do. And yes, you do get what is now, obviously, according to the traditional Holy Week, you have, in the light, by that time, a well-lit church, the preface of the Mass speaking of this night. It's true, you do have that. But this authenticity idea, again, we have to make it authentic, is a concept that we shall again encounter when we discuss the post-Vatican II reforms, which we're not going to get to. We're looking at the reign of Pius XII here. This belongs to material for really another course, which we should be nice to have that. But in any case, for the moment, I will focus on this. In February 1951, the Holy See issued a decree permitting, experimentally, and for a period of 1 year, the celebration of the Easter Vigil at night on Holy Saturday. So in and of itself, merely allowing this practice would not have been particularly objectionable. Of course, in itself, the ancient ceremonies did take place at night. It's not intrinsically evil to have any ceremonies on Holy Saturday night, obviously. But the problem here is that Bugnini and company, well, aside from the motives, Bugnini and company seized the occasion to introduce changes into the rites themselves. So it's not as though they just took the traditional Holy Saturday ceremonies and put them at night. That is not what happened. So secret was the work of his commission on this project, Bugnini says, that the publication of the renewed Ordo for Holy Saturday at the beginning of March 1951 caught even the officials of the Congregation of Rites by surprise. So they, in a sense, this is the highest liturgical congregation in the church. There is no appeal, aside from to the Pope himself, from the decrees of the SRC, and this was sprung on them. They're the ones in charge of all of that, of all the liturgical practices in the church, and it got sprung on them. They promulgated it because they were ordered to, but it seems they were not expecting it. So the surprise of Bugnini's theoretical superiors seems to be reflected in the content of the decree by which they promulgated the renewed Ordo. It is mainly devoted to discussing the change of time and mentions, almost as an afterthought, the rubrics that follow. So just at the end, oh, by the way, there are changes in the ceremonies too. Here's all the reasons we're doing this tonight. Oh, and by the way, the ceremonies have been overhauled too. Just make sure you notice that before you do the ceremonies. But these changes in the rites for the vigil were in fact quite extensive. The blessings for the Easter fire are reduced from 3 to 1. A new ceremony for inscribing the Paschal candle was introduced. And that was just completely fabricated. There was no historical precedent for that, of this. Maybe if you've ever seen the 1955 Holy Week, you know that the celebrant's supposed to put the year on the candle, the year of which this candle was blessed on the candle. There is no precedent for that. So you're supposed to inscribe the candle. Yeah, it's true that historically, traditionally, there are always grains of incense inserted into the candle with these waxed nails, but there was no inscription of the candle. The triple candle used to bring the Easter fire into the church was abolished. That was done away with. The clergy and people are supposed to carry candles. The number of prophecies is reduced from 12 to 4. The celebrant sits and listens to them. He chants the collects at the Sedilia. A pause for prayer is introduced after Flictamus Genua and the orations. The baptismal water is blessed in the sanctuary facing the people rather than in the baptistry. So that's what happens. It's true in the 1955 Holy Week. The baptismal water is blessed exactly that, facing the people in the sanctuary, and then the celebrant carries it in a tub from the sanctuary to the baptistry. So he has to be careful not to spill it as he goes. Traditionally, there was a whole separate procession that went to the baptistry. The Easter water first was blessed there, and then after that, the baptismal water, and then after that, a procession back to the sanctuary for the Litany of the Saints, and then after that, the Mass. So the tail end of Lent, so to speak, right there. But in 1955, he does it in the sanctuary, facing the people, and that is not by accident. There's at least one option, not by accident, and he has to then carry it to the baptistry. So the litany is divided into two parts and abbreviated. All present recite a renewal of baptismal vows in the vernacular. That must be done in the vernacular. And Psalm 42, so Judicame Deus, and the last gospel are dropped from the Mass. Yeah, all of those things foreshadowing aspects of the Novus Ordo, and none of that by accident. It's not just a coincidence by any means. So this renewal of baptismal vows being done in the vernacular, keep in mind that in the past, the certain use, a very, very limited use of the vernacular was permitted on some occasions. Of course, during the Mass itself, the Epistle and Gospel, the Gospel in Latin having already been recited by the celebrant, the Mass was put on hold for the recitation of the Epistle and Gospel in the vernacular, in connection with the sermon, which is, of course, in the vernacular as well. But aside from that, that's about it. Aside from other rare instances, such as in the ceremonies of baptism, when the godparents have to answer for the child, or in the case of an adult baptism, the adult himself has to answer. Is permitted that the first be done in Latin and then repeated in English, so that the godparents, this is typically the case, can respond, because they have to actually respond. So you have these two requirements. It must be done in Latin, but also the godparents must respond. As a concession, the Church permitted that it be done first in Latin. The celebrant, if that option is taken, then the celebrant has to, the minister of baptism, has to, the priest doing the ceremony, has to first recite everything in Latin, and then repeat it in the vernacular afterwards, and then the godparents answer. But that's about it, and that's for very limited parts of the ceremony. So that's about the extent of it. And that is an option. That's something that may be done by way of concession, so that all the requirements can be met. Whereas this renewal of baptismal vows, that has to be done in the vernacular. And there has to be a back and forth between the celebrant of the Mass and the people. All of this was portrayed as a restoration of antiquity, just as features of the Novus Ordo would be 2 decades later. But the claim was equally phony. The ancient Easter Vigil went from sundown on Holy Saturday to dawn on Easter Sunday. It was called the Panuchia, from the Greek for all night, lasted the entire night, and consisted of a seemingly endless series of readings, or otherwise known as lessons, chants, prayers, and litanies throughout the night. In Rome, the prophecies were chanted in Latin and then again in Greek. The petitions in the Litany of the Saints were repeated 7 times. So you think the 12 lessons, 12 prophecies in Holy Saturday in Latin, that's long. Imagine all of those done in not only Latin, but in Greek. It'd be even harder to find lectors to do them well. And imagine that Litany of the Saints 7 times. On Holy Saturday, they're doubled. The litanies are doubled as they are on certain occasions. That is to say, the petition is sung once and then repeated. Imagine doing that 7 times, repeating every petition 7 times. Since there were no pews in the churches, moreover, the laity endured all of this standing. So the number of lessons, prophecies, in 1951, and the 1951 restoration should have been tripled to, say, 36, rather than reduced to a mere 4. And laymen holding burning candles, this is Father Cicada saying this, of course. Wax in ancient times was a precious commodity, and laymen would contribute candles to the church for its support. The wax is still expensive. Getting the candles we need here, that's still a significant investment. In the early church, Handing out candles for a layman to burn would have been like me asking my suburban parishioners to burn $20 bills. Not likely. In fact, however, in the 1951 Easter Vigil, we see some principles and practices that, 18 years later, will be imposed across the board in Paul VI's Novus Ordo Missae. Abbreviating rites, 3 prayers to 1, 12 prophecies to 4. Inventing new rites, inscribing the candle, people carrying candles, renewing baptismal vows. Facing the people for ceremonies, and that's for anything more than the Dominus Vobiscum. For blessing the baptismal water. Also, just as a note, there were some places, yes, you could find, it's very rare, but you can find some places in which, due to the arrangement of the church, the celebrant of the Mass happened to be facing the altar. But, in fact, the way it was arranged, as I say, that the celebrant happened to be facing the people. He's still facing what you're used to seeing, but of course, churches were in the form of a cross. Yes, there are some rare occasions in which the altar is here, the celebrant standing here, and the people in the pews right there. But the interesting thing is that the choir stalls for the clergy were located here. So in fact, when the celebrant would turn around to say Dominus, when he would say Dominus Vobiscum, he would turn away from the people and face the clergy to say Dominus Vobiscum. So it's clear there was any arrangement like that, which is the exception, most definitely, rather than the norm. But any such instance of that, there was no idea that the celebrant is facing the people. Definitely not, just happened to be the way they were situated. It was, when he would address, say Dominus Vobiscum or Orate Fratres, he was addressing the clergy. The people just happened to be there. I mean, they might as well have been in the sides, as far as their positioning goes. They were just the place to put them. So, other precedents set here. Reducing actions of the priest. He sits and listens. Lopping off parts of the ordinary of the Mass. So the ordinary of the Mass, not to be confused with the canon of the Mass. The ordinary of the Mass, the parts that do not change. If they're not part of the designated canon, which begins with the Te Igitur Clementissime Pater, and ends with the minor elevation. That is the canon of the Mass. The ordinary of the Mass are the parts that are not, in other words, the canon can be called part of the ordinary, but the ordinary of the parts that do not change from day to day as opposed to the propers. So the propers of the Mass, the introit, the orations, the epistle, gospel, offertory verse, communion verse, post-communion prayers, all of those are the propers of the Mass, as opposed to the ordinary. So certain parts of the ordinary of the Mass were dropped, and of course reciting liturgical prayers in the vernacular, the vigil lessons, and the baptismal vows. It is therefore easy to understand why Bugnini would claim in 1955 that the 1951 Easter Vigil was the first step to a general liturgical renewal, and why the old modernist Dom Baudouin, his name pops up again, remember he was a buddy of Roncalli, would hail it as a point of arrival and a point of departure. So that's just one thing. Remember, that was 1951. It's not even talking about the rest of Holy Week. So the simplified rubrics 1955, this is also significant. These changes, known as the reduction of the rubrics to a simpler form, were promulgated in March 1955 and primarily affected the liturgical calendar, the divine office, and the number of collects the priest recited at Mass. The introduction, the work of Bugnini, states that the changes put into practice the proposals of the 1948 Memoria, remember the Memoria sulla Riforma Liturgica, a kind of memorandum, we can roughly translate it at least, on liturgical reform. The classification system for feasts was reworked to downgrade the lower-ranking feasts. Semi-double feasts became simplexes, and the rank of semi-double was suppressed, and to upgrade the rank of Sundays from semi-double to double. Various prayers recited before, during, and after the divine office were suppressed. So this is, you see, if we were to follow this, it would affect us drastically, how we sing the office from day to day. Paters, Aves, and Credos before, suppressed. The Preces, with 2 exceptions. The Suffrage of the Saints, the commemoration of the cross during Easter time. The Antiphon of Our Lady, except after Compline. As were the seasonal collects and the proper last Gospels at Mass. So all of that done away with 1955. On the traditional calendar, more important feasts are often preceded by a vigil. The 1955 changes suppressed 10 of these. One particularly significant change was the suppression of octaves, a commemoration, or really the continued celebration, of a major feast that continues throughout the week following the feast itself. So, for example, the octave of the Ascension, gone. Corpus Christi, gone. The 1955 decree suppressed 14 octaves, of which 9 dated to the 7th and 8th centuries, among them the octaves of the Epiphany, the Ascension, and the Assumption. That's a lot of octaves, 14 octaves, gone. And you could say that you can hear this from priests who have actually used, say, the John the 23rd stuff, that you can still see that there are certain vestiges of these octaves, that it's theoretically all these feasts are just one day and then it's done, but afterwards you still have there are indications that are still somehow looking back to that feast, even though no octave, they're not days in the octave, they're ferial days or something, but you can see there was once an octave there. So if this was all just all laying the groundwork for the Novus Ordo, all of this. And Father Cicada comments that most traditionalists, clergy and laity alike, are not attuned to the finer points of liturgical history and practice, and may be inclined to dismiss all the foregoing changes as inconsequential. You're like, well, what's the big deal, for example, of making Sundays from semi-doubles to doubles? What's the big deal with that? In itself, of course, it's not evil, but the men who created them did not consider these inconsequential changes. The simplification of the rubrics, Bugnini said at the time, was the second chapter of a general liturgical reform which has been going on for some years. In other words, we're definitely into this. We are well into this at this point. He was quite open about the long-term goals of the process. We are concerned with restoring, quote-unquote, the liturgy, making it a new city in which the man of our age can live and feel at ease. And Father Cicada says, a comment, to be sure, with which no traditional Catholic could feel at ease. And Bugnini again, no doubt it is still too early to assess the full portent, the full import, the full significance, all of the consequences to flow from this document, which marks an important turning point in the history of the rites of the Roman liturgy. They indicate where the reform will ultimately lead, are a bridge towards this future, and represent only a step towards more far-reaching liturgical changes. The present decree has a contingent character. It is essentially a bridge between the old and the new, and if you will, an arrow indicating the direction taken by the current restoration. The simplification does not embrace all areas which would deserve a reform, but for the moment, the things that are easiest and most obvious and with an immediate and tangible effect. In the simplification, being a bridge between the present state and the general reform, and this is added emphasis, compromise was inevitable. So in other words, this isn't quite what we wanted, but it's a good step. It's progress, a move in the right direction, as they see it. Sorry, this is all coming straight from Bugnini. This is no conspiracy theory or anything along those lines. This is in black and white by the architect of all this himself. Bugnini's assistant, Braga, said that the simplified rubrics of 1955 were a type of prelude, as it were, to the liturgical renewal which was already being prepared, certain principles of which were then put into practice. So this is Father Cicada. Traditionalists who propose conspiracy theories about the activities of the Church's enemies, or what are, and much of it is actually true. Yes, some people are crazy who have put forward ideas that are unsubstantiated and probably could not be proved. But much, of course, of what we say you can verify, and some certain things you might say that if Bugnini, who designed the new Mass, said that all of these changes that took place during the reign of Pius XII were a move towards that. If we were to say that on our own, pointing out all these things, you're just reading too much into it. Well, No, I mean, it's obvious enough. I mean, just what we see in the rites is enough anyway, obviously, as we've seen. But when take into account Bugnini's words, it's a certitude, for sure. I mean, just looking at the rites should be enough to produce moral certitude of that. But this puts any nail in the coffin that it's reading, nail in the coffin into the idea that maybe you're just reading too much into this. So traditionalists who propose conspiracy theories about the activities of the church's enemies are used to being dismissed as paranoid cranks. But in 1955, Bugnini was straightforwardly inviting supporters of the liturgical revolution to work together with him to achieve their common goal. Another quote from Bugnini: "Those who are eager for a more wholesome, realistic liturgical renewal are once more, I should say, almost invited, tacitly, to keep their eyes open and to make an accurate investigation of the principles here put forward, to see their possible applications. More than in any other field, a reform in the liturgy must be the fruit of an intelligent, enlightened collaboration of all the active forces." Again, added emphasis, but clearly important. So really the question here is, when we're considering, we see very clearly why we don't use this. The real question here is, how on earth could it possibly be reasonable to use the bridge if you're not going to this new city? Why would you get on a bridge if you're not planning on traveling across it? The obvious answer is don't get on the bridge. It's the only reasonable course of action. And so we say ample basis for applying epikeia to this. So then moving on to the new Holy Week, let's see in more detail. It was not by any means only Holy Saturday that was touched. And then this is Father Cicada. The enlightened collaboration of all the active forces produced yet another reform later that same year when, on November 16th, 1955, the Holy See promulgated the Ordo Hebdomadae Sancta Instauratus, so the renewed order for Holy Week. So Instauratus modifying their Ordo, the restored or renewed Ordo for Holy Week. The justification offered for this reform was essentially threefold: authenticity, that comes up again, conformity to ancient traditions, and pastoral fruitfulness. These themes are the ones that the same liturgical reformers will repeatedly something's wrong there, so the word fund, will repeatedly use after Vatican II, when authenticity will mean destroying the mystical or the symbolic, when conformity to ancient traditions will mean selecting only those ancient practices that can be twisted to serve modernist theology, and when pastoral fruitfulness will mean inventing didactic rites aimed at the lowest common denominator that turn the Mass into a classroom. So didactic meaning something with teaching qualities. So the term didactic efficacy meanings is a fancy way of saying the teaching effectiveness of something. So didactic rites that are purely meant for instruction. Of course, the Mass, the true Mass, does an excellent job of preaching the faith. Anybody who's been to, who goes to, maybe to the traditional Mass for the first time ever, says that this obviously notices a substantial difference between that and what they had been seeing in the Novus Ordo, because it really preaches an entirely different religion. And that everything about it, all of the actions of the celebrant, every single word of every single text in the Mass is perfectly in accordance with the teachings of the Church, proposing divine revelation, and in fact expounds upon them significantly. So in that sense, the Mass teaches very well. It's not as though the Mass is without the ability to instruct on truths of the faith. But the Mass is first of all a sacrifice, obviously. And even when there's nobody around, even if a priest says Mass all by himself, which is really not supposed to be done, under certain circumstances it might be permissible, but even if a priest says Mass completely by himself, the sacrifice is offered. Its primary end, it's by far its most important purpose. All of the ends of the Mass, in fact, are accomplished. The sacrifice is offered, and the ends of the Mass are achieved, even if nobody else is there. Even if the priest says Mass by himself or with one or two servers only. If it's a private Mass, really only should be one server, but even if he's as Mass by himself or with one server, the Mass is still accomplished. So with the benefit of hindsight, we can look at the 1955 Holy Week and see yet another series of incremental changes put into place that will be permanently incorporated in the Novus Ordo. So next time we will look at some of the details of this.